The morning sun painted streaks of orange across the LAX terminal windows as Captain Andrea Thompson walked through the bustling airport. Her navy blue uniform was crisp, her stride confident as she pulled her small carry-on behind her. Just another Tuesday morning flight to Chicago, or so she thought. The terminal was packed with the usual mix of travelers, families heading on vacation, business people typing away on their laptops, and college students with oversized headphones. But among them, 3 men stood out, though Andre didn't notice them yet. They were trying hard not to stand out, which made them stand out even more. These men weren't your typical passengers. They belonged to the Steel Dragons, one of the most notorious motorcycle gangs on the West Coast. The leader, who went by the name Thunder, kept scratching his neck where his usual leather jacket would be, uncomfortable in the borrowed business casual outfit. His partners, Spike and Ghost, sat nearby, pretending to read newspapers, but actually watching every move at Gate 23. They had been tracking their target for weeks, convinced she was DEA agent Rita Suarez, the woman who had infiltrated their operation and cost them millions in lost drug shipments. Their intel showed Agent Suarez had gotten her pilot's license as part of her cover. Now they thought they'd finally caught up with her. What they didn't know, and this would turn out to be the biggest mistake of their lives, was that Captain Andrea Thompson was something entirely different. 10 years in the Navy SEALs had taught her things that no ordinary pilot would know. After serving her country, she'd followed her childhood dream of becoming a commercial pilot, trading military operations for the peaceful skies of civilian aviation. As Andrea went through her pre-flight checks in the cockpit, she chatted with her co-pilot, Ray Kumar, about his daughter's recent dance recital. "You should have seen her face when she nailed that final spin," Ray beamed, showing Andrea a video on his phone. The normalcy of the moment stood in sharp contrast to what was about to unfold. In the terminal, Thunder gave the final briefing to his men. "Remember, we wait until we're at cruising altitude. Middle of the flight, when everyone's relaxed. We get into that cockpit, confront Agent Suarez about what she knows, and make sure she understands what happens to people who mess with the Steel Dragons." Back in the cockpit, Andre was going through her final systems check when the first passengers started boarding. The flight attendants greeted everyone with practiced smiles, helping people stow their bags and find their seats. Everything seemed normal. The crying baby in row 15, the teenager asking for a seat change, the businessman complaining about the Wi-Fi. Thunder and his men boarded separately, purposely choosing seats in different sections of the plane. They looked like any other passengers, except for their tense shoulders and the way their eyes kept darting toward the cockpit door. Andrea's voice came over the intercom, clear and professional. "Good morning, everyone. This is your captain speaking. Welcome aboard Flight 2317 to Chicago O'Hare. Our flight time today will be approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes, and we're expecting smooth sailing all the way through. The weather in Chicago is a pleasant 72 degrees with clear skies." As the plane taxied down the runway, Andrea felt that familiar surge of joy as the engines roared to life. This was why she'd become a pilot. The pure freedom of lifting a massive machine into the sky, the responsibility of keeping hundreds of people safe, the peaceful solitude above the clouds. She had no idea that in just a few hours she'd need to call upon skills she'd hoped to never use again. The plane lifted smoothly into the morning sky, banking gently over the Pacific Ocean before turning eastward. Passengers settled in with their books, tablets, and magazines. The flight attendants prepared for beverage service. Everything was running like clockwork. In row 28, Thunder checked his watch. 2 more hours until they made their move. He couldn't know that his carefully planned revenge mission was about to go spectacularly wrong, or that he and his gang had just made the mistake of targeting possibly the most dangerous pilot in commercial aviation. The early morning sun continued to climb as Flight 2317 soared eastward, carrying its unsuspecting passengers, a highly trained former Navy SEAL pilot, and 3 men about to learn a very hard lesson about checking their intelligence more carefully. The stage was set for a mid-flight confrontation that would soon become legendary in both aviation and law enforcement circles. 2 hours into the flight, the cabin had settled into that peaceful lull that usually comes after the first beverage service. Most passengers had dozed off or were absorbed in their movies, the soft hum of the engines providing a soothing backdrop to the journey. But beneath this calm surface, tension was building. Thunder glanced at his watch for the 5th time in 10 minutes. He caught Ghost's eye from across the aisle and gave a subtle nod. It was time. Their plan had been simple. Ghost would create a distraction near the back of the plane, while Spike would deal with the forward flight attendant. Thunder would use the confusion to get to the cockpit. In the galley, flight attendant Lisa Chen was preparing for the second beverage service when she noticed something odd. The passenger in 28D, Ghost, had been making frequent trips to the bathroom, each time looking more agitated than before. Years of experience had taught her to trust her instincts about unusual passenger behavior. Up in the cockpit, Captain Andrea Thompson was reviewing weather patterns on her display when Ray Kumar, her co-pilot, mentioned something that caught her attention. "That's the 3rd time the same guy has asked Jenny about the bathroom in first class. Says he's feeling sick, but he doesn't look sick to me." Andrea frowned slightly. Multiple passengers acting strangely wasn't necessarily a cause for alarm, but her military training had taught her to notice patterns. She quietly activated the cabin security camera feed on her secondary display. The first sign that something was wrong came when Ghost suddenly stumbled in the aisle, knocking over a drink cart. Ice cubes and plastic cups scattered across the floor as passengers jerked awake. In the confusion, Spike made his move toward the front, pulling something from his jacket. Lisa Chen's eyes widened as she saw the glint of metal in Spike's hand. Before she could reach for the intercom, he had grabbed her arm, pressing what felt like a knife against her side. "Don't make a sound," he whispered. "Just walk normally to the front galley." Several rows ahead, Mrs. Patterson, a retired schoolteacher from Ohio, noticed the strange interaction. She'd been watching people all her life, and something about this wasn't right. Carefully, she pressed her call button. In the cockpit, Andrea was already 2 steps ahead. The security feed showed her everything she needed to know. These weren't ordinary troublemakers. Their movements were too coordinated, too purposeful. She reached under her seat where her carry-on contained something she'd hoped never to need. A small kit from her SEAL days. Thunder stood up, straightening his borrowed business shirt. Everything was going according to plan. Ghost had the back of the plane under control, Spike had neutralized the forward flight attendant, and most passengers were still focused on the spilled drinks. He began making his way forward, trying to look like just another passenger heading to the bathroom. But he hadn't counted on Bobby Chen, a 12-year-old traveling alone who was sitting in the aisle seat playing his video game. As Thunder tried to slip past, Bobby's foot stuck out just a little too far. Thunder stumbled, cursing under his breath, drawing attention from nearby passengers. "Sir, please return to your seat. The fasten seatbelt sign is on." Jenny, the senior flight attendant, called out. She'd noticed the commotion and was trying to maintain order, unaware of the full situation. That's when everything happened at once. Ghost made his move in the back, pulling out what looked like a weapon. Passengers screamed. Spike pushed Lisa toward the cockpit door. And Thunder, realizing their element of surprise was slipping away, abandoned all pretense and lunged forward. What nobody noticed was the quiet man in 14C, Jack Wilson, an off-duty air marshal who had been tracking the Steel Dragons for months. He'd recognized Thunder during boarding, but had held back, waiting to see their plan unfold. Now he carefully reached for his phone, sending a coded message to ground control. In the cockpit, Andrea had already contacted air traffic control using a special frequency. November 7317, implementing Protocol Delta. It was a code that would clear their path for an emergency landing if needed. She then did something unexpected. She unlocked the cockpit door. Ray looked at her in shock. "What are you doing?" "Trust me," Andrea said quietly, her voice carrying the calm certainty that came from years of handling crisis situations. Sometimes the best defense is to let your enemy think they're in control. The security feed showed Thunder approaching the cockpit, with Spike and Lisa right behind him. Ghost was keeping the rear passengers contained, but Andrea could see he was nervous, his hands shaking slightly. That was important information. A nervous criminal was often the most dangerous, but also the most likely to make mistakes. Through the cockpit door, they could hear the commotion getting closer. Andrea quickly briefed Ray on what he needed to do, her words precise and measured. She had already calculated multiple scenarios in her head, each with its own set of responses. The cockpit's confined space, which might seem like a disadvantage to most, was actually perfect for what she had in mind. As the cockpit door began to open, Andrea took a deep breath. 10 years of SEAL training had taught her that the next few moments would be crucial. The key was to let them think they had the upper hand, while actually being 3 moves ahead. She could hear Thunder's breathing on the other side of the door, could sense his confidence in their plan. What he didn't know was that he was walking into a trap of her own making. Andrea had positioned herself perfectly, remembering her old instructor's words. The best position is the one your opponent doesn't expect you to be in. She allowed herself a small smile. These men were about to learn a very expensive lesson about the importance of verifying their intelligence. The cockpit door swung open with a soft click that seemed to echo in Andrea's ears. Thunder stepped in first, his borrowed business casual outfit now rumpled from the confrontation in the cabin. Behind him, Spike held onto Lisa's arm, trying to look tough but clearly uncomfortable in the tight space. "Agent Suarez," Thunder said with a sneer, "did you really think we wouldn't find you?" He looked around the cockpit, taking in the various instruments and displays with obvious confusion. Andrea kept her hands visible on the controls, maintaining a perfectly calm demeanor that came from years of handling high-pressure situations. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said evenly, her voice carrying just the right mix of authority and composure. Ray, her co-pilot, remained still, following the subtle hand signal Andrea had given him earlier. He'd been a pilot for 15 years, but this was definitely not covered in flight school. "No misunderstanding," Thunder shot back. "We know exactly who you are. DEA Agent Rita Suarez, working undercover. You infiltrated our operation, cost us millions, but you made one mistake. You got your pilot's license, and we found you." A hint of a smile played at the corner of Andrea's mouth. "I hate to disappoint you, but I'm not Rita Suarez. My name is Captain Andre Thompson, 20 years of flying experience, including 10 years with the Navy before joining commercial aviation." Thunder laughed, but there was a note of uncertainty in it. "Nice try. We've been tracking you for weeks. We have photos." He pulled out a slightly crumpled photograph from his pocket and held it up. Andre glanced at the photo. It showed a woman who, admittedly, shaded some of her features: dark hair, athletic build, similar height. But to anyone looking closely, they were clearly different people. "Look at that photo again," Andrea suggested calmly. "Look at the eyes. Agent Suarez has brown eyes. Mine are green. Check my pilot's license if you want. It's in my flight bag." Doubt flickered across Thunder's face. He looked at the photo, then at Andrea, then back at the photo. Spike shifted uncomfortably behind him, his grip on Lisa's arm loosening slightly. In the cabin, the situation was getting tense. Ghost was trying to keep control of the passengers, but his nervousness was becoming more apparent. Mrs. Patterson, the retired teacher, had quietly begun passing notes to nearby passengers, organizing a silent resistance just like she used to coordinate her students during fire drills. The off-duty Air Marshal, Jack Wilson, had managed to text another update to ground control: situation contained to cockpit and forward cabin. 3 perpetrators, passengers safe but tense, standing by for opportunity. Back in the cockpit, Thunder was starting to realize things weren't going as planned. "If you're not Suarez, then explain how you got this job right when we tracked her to this airline." "I've been flying this route for 3 years," Andre replied. "Check with the airline. Call them right now if you want. I'm guessing your intel showed Agent Suarez got her pilot's license recently. Commercial aviation requires years of experience. The math doesn't add up." Ray watched the exchange with growing amazement. His captain was somehow managing to control the situation without even leaving her seat. There was something about her manner, her confidence, that seemed to be affecting the hijackers. Thunder ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident on his face. "This doesn't make sense." "Our information was solid. We tracked her movements, we followed the leads." "Intelligence is only as good as its verification," Andrea said, her tone almost sympathetic. "In my previous line of work, we had a saying: check twice, act once." Speaking of which, she glanced at her instruments, then back at Thunder. "We're about to hit some turbulence." As if on cue, the plane gave a slight shudder. Thunder stumbled slightly, catching himself on the back of Andrea's seat. Spike's grip on Lisa loosened further as he reached for the wall to steady himself. That's when Andre saw it, the telltale signs of a plan falling apart. Thunder's confidence was cracking. Spike was looking increasingly uncertain, and through the cabin camera feed, she could see Ghost checking his phone repeatedly, clearly waiting for updates that weren't coming. "You have about 2 minutes to make a decision," Andre said calmly, her hands still on the controls. "The turbulence is going to get worse. We're heading into a weather system that I've been tracking. Right now, you have options. In 2 minutes, those options start disappearing." The plane shook again, harder this time. In the cabin, several passengers grabbed their armrests. Ghost nearly dropped his phone, his face showing clear panic. Thunder looked at the photo again, then at Andre's calm green eyes, then at the increasingly active weather radar display. The certainty that had fueled their revenge mission was crumbling with each passing second. "How do we know you're telling the truth?" he demanded, but his voice had lost its edge. "Because in about 30 seconds, we're going to hit the edge of that storm system," Andre replied. "When we do, I'm going to need both hands on these controls, and you're going to need to make a choice. Trust that I'm telling you the truth and let me do my job, or risk the lives of everyone on this plane because you didn't double-check your intel." The plane shuddered again, more violently this time. Through the cockpit window, dark clouds loomed ahead. Thunder looked at Spike, who had completely released Lisa in favor of holding onto the wall. The tough guy act was falling apart in the face of nature's power and a pilot's unwavering confidence. What they didn't know was that Andre had already calculated everything: the turbulence pattern, the angles of the cockpit, the positions of everyone in the small space. She knew exactly what would happen next. The only question was whether Thunder would figure out his mistake before or after she had to demonstrate why targeting a former Navy SEAL was the worst decision the Steel Dragons had ever made. The turbulence hit exactly as Andre had predicted. The plane dropped suddenly, then bucked upward, sending loose items clattering across the cockpit floor. Thunder grabbed the back of the captain's chair, his knuckles white. In the main cabin, Ghost stumbled, nearly dropping his phone as passengers gasped and gripped their armrests. Andre's hands moved smoothly across the controls, adjusting their heading with the precision of someone who had weathered far worse storms. "Ray, check our alternate routes," she called to her co-pilot, her voice steady despite the chaos. "We might need to divert around the worst of this system." Thunder was looking increasingly unsure of himself. The photograph in his hand trembled as he glanced between it and Andre's focused profile. The one in the photo did look similar, but now he was noticing all the small differences: the shape of the jaw, the set of the shoulders, the confidence that came from years of real flight experience rather than a recently acquired pilot's license. In the cabin, the Air Marshal, Jack Wilson, used the turbulence as cover to move 3 rows closer to the front. He caught Mrs. Pavison's eye, giving her a subtle nod. The retired teacher had already organized a quiet network among the passengers, passing information back and forth through whispers and handwritten notes. Bobby Chen, the 12-year-old who had accidentally tripped Thunder earlier, was proving to be unexpectedly helpful. He kept his video game volume up high, the cheerful gaming music providing cover for the whispered communications passing between passengers. His mother would have been proud of his quick thinking. "Look," Andrea said, her eyes still on the instruments as she guided the plane through another rough patch. "I understand you're after someone who wronged you. But right now, you're putting innocent lives at risk based on flawed intelligence. Ghost back there is about to lose it. Look at him." Thunder glanced at the cabin feed. Ghost was indeed looking increasingly unstable, jumping at every bump and shake of the aircraft. Some of the passengers had noticed too, and were watching him with growing concern. Lisa, the flight attendant who had been released during the turbulence, had quietly positioned herself near the galley emergency equipment. Years of training had taught her to be ready for anything, and she could tell something was about to happen. "We have more weather cells developing to the north," Ray reported, his voice professional despite the tension. "Recommend heading 030 to avoid the worst of it." Andrea nodded, beginning a gentle turn that sent Thunder stumbling again. "The thing about situations like this," she continued conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather over coffee, "is that they can end in different ways. Right now, you still have choices." The plane shuddered again, and Spike finally spoke up for the first time since entering the cockpit. Thunder, man, something's not right here. Look at how she handles the plane. Suarez just got her license. She couldn't fly like this. In the cabin, Ghost's nervousness had reached a breaking point. Thunder, he called out, his voice cracking. We need to talk. This isn't going like you said it would. The off-duty air marshal watched Ghost's growing panic with professional interest. He'd seen this before, the moment when a carefully planned operation started to unravel. He texted another update to ground control, situation evolving. Suspects showing signs of doubt, standing by. Andre kept her voice calm as she adjusted their course again. You know what's interesting about Navy SEAL training? They teach you to recognize patterns. Like how Ghost back there keeps checking his phone, he's waiting for confirmation from someone, isn't he? Someone who was supposed to verify that Agent Suarez would be on this flight. Thunder's expression changed. How did you know about? The same way I know that you're not really the one in charge, Andre continued, her eyes meeting his in the reflection of the darkened cockpit window. You're following someone else's plan. Someone who gave you that photo and told you this would be an easy revenge mission. But they got it wrong, didn't they? The plane hit another patch of rough air. Through the cabin camera, they could see Ghost nearly lose his balance. Several passengers steadied themselves, and in the confusion, Jack Wilson moved another 2 rows forward. Think about it, Andrea pressed on. If I were an undercover DEA agent, would I be able to handle this plane through severe turbulence while maintaining a conversation? Would I have 3 years of documented flight history with this airline? Would I have green eyes when your photo clearly shows brown ones? Thunder looked at the photo again, doubt now clearly visible on his face. The turbulence had shaken more than just the plane. It had shaken his confidence in their entire plan. Lisa caught movement in her peripheral vision. Mrs. Patterson was discreetly passing something forward, a note that was making its way to the air marshal. The passengers had created their own silent communication network right under Ghost's increasingly unstable watch. You have about 30 seconds to make a decision, Andrea said, her tone still remarkably calm as she adjusted their heading again. That's when we'll hit the next weather cell. When we do, things are going to get interesting. Ghost back there looks like he's about to make a very poor decision. Your plan is falling apart, and I'm running out of smooth air to fly through. She paused, letting her words sink in. So what's it going to be? Do you want to figure out who really sent you on this mission, or do you want to find out why the Navy spent so much money training pilots like me to handle situations exactly like this one? The next wave of turbulence hit like a hammer. The plane dropped suddenly, causing several passengers to cry out in alarm. Ghost, already on edge, stumbled forward into an empty seat, his phone clattering to the floor. In the cockpit, Thunder grabbed the back of Andrea's chair even tighter, while Spike pressed himself against the wall. That's the edge of the storm cell, Andrea announced calmly, her hands steady on the controls. The next one's going to be worse. She glanced at the radar display, which showed angry red patches of weather ahead. Ray, prepare for alternate approach Vector 3. Ray nodded, understanding the hidden meaning in her words. Vector 3 wasn't just a flight path, it was one of the emergency scenarios they had discussed earlier. He began adjusting his controls, playing his part perfectly. In the main cabin, Bobby Chen had stopped pretending to play his game. The 12-year-old's eyes were fixed on Ghost, who was now visibly sweating as he retrieved his fallen phone. The screen was cracked, making it even harder for him to read any messages that might come through. Mrs. Patterson, watching from her seat, saw an opportunity. She pulled out her teacher's notebook and wrote something quickly, passing it forward. The note made its way through the passenger network they had created, finally reaching Jack Wilson, the air marshal. Thunder was starting to piece things together, though not fast enough. This doesn't make sense, he muttered, looking at the crumpled photo again. The intel said she'd be alone in the cockpit, that she'd be an easy target. That... He stopped suddenly, realizing he'd said too much. That's interesting, Andre said, adjusting their course slightly. Someone told you I'd be alone? Commercial flights always have 2 pilots. That's basic aviation law. Sounds like whoever gave you that intel doesn't know much about airlines. She paused, letting that sink in, almost like they wanted you to get caught. The plane shuddered again, and through the cabin camera feed, they could see Ghost losing what remained of his composure. He had given up trying to look threatening and was now just staring at his broken phone, mumbling something to himself. Lisa, the flight attendant, had positioned herself strategically near the emergency equipment, catching meaningful glances from several passengers who were part of Mrs. Patterson's impromptu communication network. The retired teacher had somehow managed to coordinate half the cabin without saying a word out loud. "Time's running out," Andrea said, her voice carrying that same calm authority. "That next stell is coming up fast, and when it hits, everyone needs to be seated and buckled in, including you three." She gestured to the weather radar. "Unless you want to find out what it feels like to bounce off the ceiling." Thunder looked at the radar screen, then at his increasingly unstable teammate in the cabin, then back at the photo in his hand. "How do I know you're not bluffing about the weather?" As if in answer, the plane hit another rough patch. This time, Spike actually lost his footing, grabbing Thunder's shoulder to stay upright. Through the cockpit window, they could see the dark wall of clouds looming ahead. "The thing about nature," Andrea said as she began another course adjustment, "is that it doesn't bluff. But you know what does? People who send others to do their dirty work. People who give out bad intelligence and don't care who gets hurt." In the cabin, Bobby Chen had started humming, the same tune from his game, but louder now. Other passengers picked it up, and soon there was a subtle but noticeable rhythm to the cabin. It had a strange calming effect, making Ghost's agitation stand out even more. The air marshal had positioned himself perfectly now, ready to move at a moment's notice. Mrs. Patterson's note network had ensured that key passengers knew exactly what to do when the time came. Even the businesswoman in 14D, who had been complaining about the Wi-Fi earlier, was now part of their silent resistance. "Last chance," Andrea said, her eyes on the instruments. "That storm cell hits in about 45 seconds. You can either tell me who really sent you, or you can find out why the Navy spent millions training pilots like me to handle hostile situations in tight spaces." Thunder's face showed the battle happening in his mind. The photo in his hand suddenly felt like it was burning him. Everything had seemed so clear this morning. Get on the plane, find Agent Suarez, make her pay for infiltrating their operation. Now nothing made sense anymore. The plane jolted again, harder this time. In the cabin, Ghost's phone slipped from his trembling hands again, skittering under a seat. He dove after it frantically, completely forgetting his role in the hijacking. Several passengers exchanged knowing looks. The coordinated plan Mrs. Patterson had helped create was ready. 30 seconds, Andrea announced, her voice cutting through the tension. "And here's something else to consider. Look at Ghost down there. Really look at him. He's not acting like someone who chose to be here. He's acting like someone who was forced to be here. Just like you were, weren't you?" Thunder's eyes widened slightly, and Andrea knew she hit the mark. 20 seconds, she continued. "Just enough time to decide if you want to go down for someone else's revenge plot or help us figure out who set you up." The storm clouds ahead had turned almost black. Ray's hands moved across his controls, preparing for what was coming. Lisa stood ready near the emergency equipment, her eyes locked on the air marshal's position. Mrs. Patterson had her notebook ready, and Bobby Chen's game music had created the perfect cover for the passengers' final preparations. Thunder looked at the photo one last time, then at Andrea's reflection in the darkened window. The resemblance that had seemed so perfect this morning now looked superficial at best. But it was her eyes that finally convinced him. They held none of the uncertainty of a newly licensed pilot. Instead, they showed the absolute confidence of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of situation. 10 seconds, Andrea said quietly. "What's it going to be?" The storm hit with full force just as Thunder opened his mouth to speak. The plane lurched violently, and this time no one was prepared. In the cabin, Ghost lost his balance completely, sprawling into the aisle. The cracked phone he'd been clutching slid all the way to the back of the plane, disappearing under the last row of seats. Everyone in their seats, now. Andrea's voice carried through the cabin with unmistakable authority. She guided the aircraft through the turbulence with expertise, her movements precise and controlled despite the chaos around her. Thunder had to grab the cockpit wall with both hands, the photograph of Agent Suarez floating forgotten to the floor. In that moment, watching Andrea handle the massive aircraft through severe turbulence while maintaining total composure, the last of his certainty crumbled. "It was Rodriguez," he blurted out, nearly losing his balance as the plane bucked again. "Vincent Rodriguez. He gave us the intel, said it was a perfect chance for revenge. said it would be easy. Another jolt cut him off. In the main cabin, Mrs. Paverson's carefully orchestrated plan sprang into action. As Ghost scrambled after his phone, passengers began moving with surprising coordination. The businessman from 17 City and a college student from 22 helped an elderly couple secure their seatbelts. Others quietly passed oxygen masks forward, preparing for any possibility. "Ray, engage backup stabilizers," Andrea commanded, her focus unwavering. "Thunder, if you're telling the truth about Rodriguez, now's the time to prove it. Your friend Ghost is about to do something extremely unwise." The cabin feed showed Ghost becoming increasingly erratic. He'd given up on finding his phone and was now standing in the aisle, looking wildly around as the plane continued to shake. Several passengers had their phones out, quietly recording his breakdown. "Ghost, hey," Thunder called out through the cockpit door. "Stand down, it's not what we thought." But Ghost was beyond listening. The combination of turbulence, stress, and the realization that their plan had completely unraveled pushed him over the edge. He reached into his jacket, his hand trembling. That's when Bobby Chen's video game music suddenly blasted at full volume, startling Ghost just as the plane hit another patch of rough air. He stumbled backward, directly into the path of Air Marshal Jack Wilson, who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The tackle was so smooth, so professional, that many passengers initially thought Ghost had simply fallen. Wilson had him secured before anyone could even process what had happened. Mrs. Paverson's notebook network had worked perfectly. Every passenger who needed to know had been prepared, and those who didn't need to know were safely out of the way. In the cockpit, Thunder watched the scene unfold on the security feed with a mixture of relief and resignation. "Rodriguez played us," he said quietly, almost to himself. Said Suarez was working alone, that she'd be an easy target. But he knew, he had to have known, that you'd be walking into a trap. Andrea finished for him, adjusting their course through a slightly calmer patch of air. Of course he knew. Think about it, what better way to eliminate loose ends than to send them on an impossible mission? Spike, who had been quiet throughout most of the ordeal, finally spoke up. The real Agent Suarez, she was getting close to something big, wasn't she? Something Rodriguez wanted to keep hidden. The plane shuddered again, but less violently now. They were starting to emerge from the worst of the storm. Through the cockpit window, patches of lighter clouds were becoming visible. "I need both of you to make a choice right now," Andrea said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You can either help us understand exactly what Rodriguez is trying to hide, or you can take your chances with the FBI at our emergency landing site. They're already waiting, by the way. Have been since about 20 minutes into this adventure." In the cabin, Lisa was helping the Air Marshal secure Ghost, who had gone from panic to complete silence. The other passengers were watching with a mixture of relief and amazement, many still filming on their phones. Mrs. Patterson had tears in her eyes, not from fear, but from pride in how her fellow passengers had come together. Bobby Chen had switched his game to victory music, which somehow seemed perfectly appropriate for the moment. The elderly couple from 12B were sharing their cookies with nearby passengers, turning the whole scene into something almost surreal. "Rodriguez has a bigger operation," Thunder said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of revelation. "The motorcycle gang, the drug runs, it's all just a cover. He's got people in airports across the country. That's how he knew about this flight. But what he's really moving." He paused, looking at Spike, who nodded slowly. "Show them the real phone," Spike said quietly. "The one with the proof." Thunder reached into his sock and pulled out a second phone, one that hadn't been part of the original plan. "Everything's on here. The real operation, the airport connections, the actual reason he wanted Agent Suarez gone. We were supposed to be the fall guys, weren't we? Take the blame when this went wrong." Andrea nodded to Ray, who had already contacted air traffic control about their new heading. "I'm guessing Rodriguez didn't expect you to walk into a cockpit with someone who spent a decade learning how to spot exactly these kinds of operations. Or for a retired teacher to organize an entire plane full of passengers into a resistance movement. Or for an air marshal to be on board who's probably been wanting to crack this case for months." The plane broke through the last of the storm clouds into clear air, the sun streaming through the cockpit window like a spotlight on the truth. Thunder looked at the phone in his hand, then at Andrea's steady gaze in the reflection. "Serge," she said, allowing herself a small smile, "why don't you tell us exactly what Vincent Rodriguez has been trying to hide? I think we've all earned the right to know." 20 minutes after breaking through the storm, Flight 2317 made a smooth landing at O'Hare International Airport. As the plane taxied to a special terminal area, Andrea could see the lineup of FBI vehicles waiting on the tarmac, their lights flashing in the afternoon sun. What the federal agents didn't know yet was that they were about to stumble onto something much bigger than a simple hijacking attempt. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had transformed completely. The elderly couple from 12B had shared their entire package of cookies, turning the last part of the flight into something that felt almost like a celebration. Bobby Chen was teaching other kids his age how to play his favorite game soundtrack on their phones, creating an impromptu concert in the back of the plane. Mrs. Patterson sat with her notebook, now filled with the names and contact information of passengers who had been part of her remarkable communication network. "You know," she said to the businesswoman next to her, "in 30 years of teaching, I never had a class work together this well." Air Marshal Wilson kept Ghost secured but comfortable, even offering him a cup of water. The former hijacker had calmed down considerably, especially after Thunder had explained through the cabin intercom how Rodriguez had set them all up. In the cockpit, Thunder and Spike had spent the last part of the flight showing Andrea and Ray the contents of the hidden phone. The evidence was staggering. Rodriguez wasn't just running drugs through the motorcycle gang. There had been a cover for a massive international smuggling operation using commercial airlines. "He has people in airports across 6 countries, Thunder explained, scrolling through encrypted messages. "The motorcycle gang stuff, the drug runs, it was all just noise. Keep law enforcement focused on the obvious while the real operation went on right under their noses. And Agent Suarez was getting close to exposing it all," Andrea added, understanding now why Rodriguez had been so desperate to eliminate her. "So he sent you 3 on what he hoped would be a suicide mission. Take out the DEA agent, create a huge incident, and let you take the fall while he slipped away." Ray shook his head in amazement as he helped guide the plane to its parking position. "And if you had succeeded in taking out the wrong person, the real Agent Suarez would have been thrown off the trail while everyone focused on investigating this incident." The phone contained everything: names, dates, flight numbers, and most importantly, proof of who was really in charge. Rodriguez had been sloppy, believing his pawns would never survive to expose him. It was the kind of mistake that people at the top often made, underestimating those they thought were beneath them. As the plane came to a stop, Andrea made one final cabin announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've arrived safely in Chicago. Please remain seated while our special guests are escorted off first." And she paused, allowing herself a small smile. "Thank you all for showing what people can do when they work together." The FBI agents were surprised to find not just 3 subdued hijackers, but a wealth of evidence about an international smuggling ring. Air Marshal Wilson had already called ahead to his superiors, setting in motion what would become one of the largest international law enforcement operations of the year. Mrs. Patterson's passenger network had documented everything on their phones: Ghost's breakdown, the coordination among passengers, even the moment when Bobby Chen's perfectly timed video game music had disrupted the final crisis. These recordings would later become key evidence in multiple federal investigations. The elderly couple insisted on giving their last cookies to Thunder and Spike as they were led off the plane. "Everyone deserves a little kindness," the old woman said, "especially when they choose to do the right thing in the end." Bobby Chen high-fived the air marshal as he passed by, then turned to Andrea. "Captain, my mom says I can't be a pilot because I play too many video games. But after today?" Andrea smiled. "Tell your mom that situational awareness is situational awareness, whether it comes from flight training or gaming. You helped keep people calm today. That's what real heroes do." The FBI agents were already coordinating with international law enforcement before the last passenger had disembarked. Rodriguez's empire began crumbling within hours as arrests were made across 3 continents. The real Agent Suarez, who had indeed been closing in on the operation, would later say that the failed hijacking had accomplished what months of undercover work couldn't. It had exposed the entire network. 2 weeks later, Andrea received a package in her mailbox. Inside was Mrs. Patterson's notebook, now transformed into a bound book. Every passenger had signed it, adding their own memories of that remarkable flight. Bobby Chen had drawn a picture of the cockpit, with Andrea at the controls looking as calm as if she were playing one of his video games. The airline implemented new security protocols based on the incident, but they also did something unusual. They created a passenger coordination training program inspired by Mrs. Patterson's quick-thinking communication network. They called it the Patterson Protocol. 6 months later, Andrea was teaching a new course at the airline's training center, Community Response in Crisis Situations. Her first guest speakers were a retired teacher, a 12-year-old gamer, and 2 former motorcycle gang members who had chosen to tell their story to help others avoid being manipulated by criminals. The thing about a crisis, Andrea would tell her students, showing them the now famous footage from Flight 2317, is that it doesn't just reveal who people are, it reveals who they can become when they work together. And somewhere in the back of her classroom, a framed package of cookie crumbs hung on the wall, a reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can help turn a potential tragedy into a triumph of human spirit.